Quad66 Betaflight 4.3 release candidate 2 is out, so I think it's a good time to go ahead and update some videos on setup and tuning for the ultralight micros. So specifically what I'm going to do is focus on that little niche because it's one that's not as well covered by the usual major players. So this assumes that you otherwise know Betaflight fairly well and how to set up a quad. And we're just going to focus in on these things that are specific to these ultralight micros. So we're talking about 2 to 3 inch props with 1 to 3S. So diving right into it, in general what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go down these tabs, tab by tab, and talk about the changes that are specific or things you need to do specific to set up the micro. I'm going to jump ahead though first to the presets because this is the biggest change and most important change in terms of setup for 4.3. If you don't know what presets are, then go watch Bardwell or UAV Tech because they are potentially hugely useful. So if you're watching this, you're probably going to be interested in at least looking at my presets and whether or not you use them or not. But to get them, you want to go ahead and get the information from the description below. But basically, you put in my URL here to my repository, and you go ahead and put in my branch, the Quad66 branch, and then you save it, and then you make it active, and then you hit OK. And once you've done that, then you will be able to see all the presets for different things that I have in here. But before you go grabbing these presets, you have to still understand the setup and what's in the setup to make sure that you're not grabbing presets that are missing elements or that have conflicting elements. And in my presets themselves, as much as I've tried to have like redundancy, there's still a good example of how they can not go well for you. So what you need to know. Configuration. So in general, in configuration, we're typically dealing with these little F411 boards. The F411 boards have a small processor and not a lot of memory. In fact, Betaflight hardly fits on them anymore. And Betaflight, if you tried to just run it full tilt, would overload the processor. So we need to do a couple things to reduce the load on the processor. One of those things is the PID loop frequency. We want to take it down to 4K. And then also, once you have everything set up, so your board orientation is correct and this little model moves the way you think it should, you want to go ahead and turn off everything you don't need, such as the accelerometer. Things that you want to leave on, so and turning those off are going to decrease the load on the CPU. Things that you want to lead on are things like air mode and OSD. And then we also have to go under the hood to overclock our F411. So what you're going to want to do is type in the command line, set CPU overclock, and for the F411 there's two options. You can see 108, which is the default, and 120, which is the overclock, and we want to go for 120. And then in Betaflight, anytime you put in a command like that, so we set CPU overclock, you still need to do save, and hitting save and rebooting it is actually what saves it to your flight controller. So that takes care of everything here on the configuration page, and we can move on to the power and battery. So power and battery, the numbers here matter, not just to warn you, but because we use VBAT sag compensation. So VBAT sag compensation is a fantastic feature that makes the quad fly similar whether you're at the beginning of the battery or the end of the battery. But for that feature to work well, you need to put in realistic numbers for both the start and end of the battery. If you put this number too low, then what's going to happen is that it's going to overcompensate for you and you're going to lose performance. So since we're flying on high volt cells, I typically find you have to bump this up to 4.4 so you don't get the error on arming on a very fresh battery. And then you really want to set this number at a voltage that's at the end of your flight. 3.4 or 3.5 is probably going to be appropriate. Set it any lower and you're going to lose performance. I'm going to click over failsafe. We already talked about presets, and we're going to get to PID tuning. Before we talk about the PID, we really need to talk about the rate and filter. I'm going to start with the rate, which is seemingly straightforward. Mainly, hopefully you're on actual rates at this point. But one of the things to consider is that as we fly with a lot of feed forward, we need to think about, and we're flying on these really fast RC links, we want to think about jitter and noise in our signal to noise ratio. One of the problems with using a ton of expo and having a really flat middle here of the curve is that although it may feel nice to have that resolution, basically what you're doing is you're swamping your signal because your signal is real small when you change the stick position with all the noise that's there. So in general, for best performance, you want to keep this through here as linear as you are comfortable flying. Also, your max velocity, you want that as low as you need in general. For filtering, basically you don't want to tailor filtering to your quad. You want to tailor your quad and your PID tune to your filtering. The reason for that is these little quads, they really need all the help they can, and in terms for the PID loop to work well, you really need as little latency as possible. So on these filter sliders, the more we move to the right, the more we decrease our filtering. The more we move to the left, the more we increase our filtering. The more filtering you have, the more latency you have, and the less effective your PID loop is, much more prone to oscillations and things like that. So basically what you want to do is you want to be able to get your quad to this level of filtering or even less filtering, or you want to fix your quad in terms of making it a cleaner build with a stronger frame, cleaner motors, whatever else you might need. In order to push our PIDs all the way this way, you want to make sure you're enabled in expert mode. That'll be true on our PIDs also. And then once you have this all the way over to the right, you want to turn off gyro low pass 1. You do need to leave on the gyro low pass 2 because this takes care of our aliasing. So this we need because we're running that PID loop at 4K instead of 8K. Otherwise, on this, I'm leaving everything as is from default, other than going under the hood and turning down our Q for our RPM notch filter. So we've got quite a few notches because we've got 3 harmonics, so it's got 3 axes, so 3 per harmonic, so it's 9 total notches, and that's quite a few. And so we want to narrow them down, tighten them up a little bit to decrease latency a little bit. So to do that, we do set RPM filter Q, and the default is 500, and we want to go narrower, so higher numbers are narrower, so we want to increase the Q number to 750, and then make sure you remember to save it. And that sets up the filters we want. Now, then we go back to our PIDs, and we can start tuning our PIDs. Well, we can almost start tuning our PIDs. We've got a couple more things to set up here. One of the really important ones to set up is your feed forward. You've got to have appropriate jitter reduction, smoothness, and averaging. And unfortunately, this has to be specific to your RC link. So this will be different if you're on Express LRS versus if you're on FR Sky, if you're on Crossfire. So for Express LRS, what I recommend if you're running at 500 Hertz, I recommend a jitter reduction at 5, a smoothness of 50, and 2-point averaging. This is a little bit more aggressive than what Chris Thompson, CT Snooze, recommends. He recommends 65 here, so if you want to be a little bit more cautious, you can go 65, but you're going to give up a little bit of performance by going to 65. I'll do a deeper dive on that when we talk about PID tuning, but this is my recommendation for now at this point. So other things, they've changed, so you can see D-min is gone. Now it's replaced by D-max. Actually, it's your derivative. D-min is replaced by derivative, and they've changed D to D-max. But the upshot is basically most of the time you're flying on derivative, and then it boosts up to D-max in hard maneuvers. I don't think that works really well for these micros because what your derivative does, so it's damping, but you can actually think of it as artificial mass. It's like flight controller induced mass by resisting motion. And so what we want is we want mass, we want inertia when we're kind of in forward flight and things like that, because these quads are so small and light, they get bumped around, and we don't want them to get bumped around, so we want this to be high. On the other hand, when we're going into hard maneuvers, our motors aren't super powerful. We're not like ripping the props off, so we don't need this boost up to D-max, in my opinion. Maybe in some cases that's not true, but that's my opinion. And that's my recommendation on this. I need to experiment more with it. But what I recommend still, like we've been doing on 4.2, is turning off D-min, or in this case D-max. And the way to do that, we don't have a little switch anymore, but what we can do is put in 0, 0 in this slot here for gain and advance, and this turns it off. So when you put 0, 0 for gain and advance, it basically locks it in at derivative, and this is the only number you need to worry about. That makes this number, it just doesn't come into play. Other things we do over here is I talked about VBAT sag compensation. So you want this at 100%. That makes your quad the most consistent start to finish on the battery. If you want some hero watts at the beginning, maybe you don't do quite as much, but I'd recommend 100%. Thrust linearization. We don't need as much thrust linearization as we used to, partially because the 1203 and 13mm motors are a little bit more powerful, but also because of some changes to the tune and specifically dynamic idle. So dynamic idle, you do want that on, and to have this on, you do need your bidirectional D-shot. So you need either the JESC or Blue Jay, and you also need that for RPM filtering. I should have mentioned that a second ago. But with dynamic idle, I used to recommend a lower number, and I used to recommend going as low as you possibly could to avoid desyncs. But I have, through just trial and error and also some kind of like further just thinking about it, I actually recommend going a little bit higher, and I recommend a number of 35. So 35 times 100 is 3,500, and so that's the minimum idle RPM that's enforced when you're at 0 throttle input, or when throttle drops low enough to where this should be, enforced. The reason I've gone up on this number is for a couple of reasons. One of those reasons is that I've just found it a little bit more robust than trying to push it as low as possible. The other thing is that these motors are small, and the torque that they have just absolutely falls off a cliff if you let them spin down too low. And so what I found is 35 is pretty consistent to kind of keep them up out of that, falling off of that cliff, and that really helps the responsiveness in the PID at the, throttle responsiveness in your PID at the low RPMs. And so I recommend 35. What's kind of interesting enough is that the Betaflight devs seem to have come to similar conclusions, and we can see what they're recommending now is that they're recommending the number of 30 to 35 as well. So that's kind of interesting. Let's see, what else we got? So that should cover it on this screen. I'm going to do other videos about the PID tuning, the sliders, and things like that. Going into our receiver. Obviously, if you're on Crossfire or ExpressOS or Ghost, you're going to be on Crossfire here. And I recommend just leaving the smoothing at 30. You can, for a little bit more responsiveness, you can bump this down to like 20 or 25, but that's going to put more noise into your system. And I think that 30, the default value, is pretty good. Motors tab is some big changes here. So one of the things that's inconvenient about this change, so I understand why they put bidirectional D-shot here, which we need to turn on. We need to turn this on to get our RPM filtering and also our dynamic idle. The problem is the motors tab is below the PID tuning tab, and if we're just kind of progressing down this way, we can't do some of the stuff we did back up in the PID tuning tab until we've turned on bidirectional D-shot. So if you're going down the row, you got to flip that on first and then go back and get the other stuff. So for our little micros, we're usually on 12 pole motors almost all the time, so you can put in 12 there. And then because our PID loop is at 4K, we got to drop this down to D-shot 300, and I think the software now kind of enforces that, so you shouldn't have to worry about it, but just double check to make sure. So that's kind of the setup things in terms of things, boxes to check and things like that. And then a quick segue here. It's not really a segue, but it's just like a thank you, Betaflight, for improving this. But so with these little micros, we're oftentimes flipping the boards or rotating them, and we often had to reorder our motors. That used to be horribly painful, and it is no longer painful. So now what you do is you just get this little wizard going, and it'll spin up a motor, and you just click the motor that's spinning, and it will reorder your motors, and you're good to go, and that's awesome. And then also motor direction. Again, we've got this little wizard. It spins the motors, and you just spin them, and then you reverse whatever you need to reverse, and you stop, and you're done, and you're good to go. That is so much easier than going into the ESCs to reversing them. So much easier than going into the command line to reorder our motors. So that's like a thank you, so much easier now. Last thing while we're in here, and we actually should have done that before we went through that was to make sure we click this to props out. I hadn't done props out before, mainly because I was basically lazy and it was inconvenient, but now, because of how easy these wizards are, I've switched over everything to props out. So you just hit that and you go through your wizard and you're good to go there. I think that covers everything that we need to kind of jump through here. Most of the times we don't have black box logging. So presets, what does that mean about presets? I've tried to make this as easy for you and actually as easy for myself as possible. So in my branch, you'll still see some of these other default things. Part of that is because I haven't been able to clean out all of them because of some issues with how GitHub works. And the other part too is some of these, it's kind of nice to have another option. If you don't like what you did, you can pick a default. But the thing to know about these presets is you got to kind of like figure out what's in them and how to bundle these presets together to not end up with some unexpected result. And I'll show you an example of that. So one of them is when I go through my tune. So with my tunes, I've tried to be really good about these presets of kind of documenting, of saying, hey, I recommend you using, like for example with my tune, I recommend you using my filter preset. I recommend you using, or I'm saying it's required that you have dynamic idle. And then I talk about feed forward, the jitter reduction, making sure that you have the settings you need. And then you can also go into these presets and actually look at the CLI. One of the things that's tricky about some of these, and for the tune, I followed kind of the precedence set by Betaflight and CT Snooze, where when you go into your preset for the tune, first what it does is it defaults a lot of things. And the reason it defaults a lot of things is to keep you out of trouble. Basically, it resets everything to a starting point so that when you change things, you don't end up with something weird that gets you into trouble. And for the most part, that's good. Occasionally, though, it's not good if you have two things in different places. And in this case, I believe we did. So by convention, that sort of Chris Thompson and Betaflight has set is that they are putting the feed forward jitter reduction settings and smoothing settings into the RC link. So for example, you've got my RC link here for Express LRS, and this is what I'm recommending for a setup. And you can see the things I'm recommending is you got to make sure your RC smoothing is on. I'm recommending feed forward averaging of 2 point, feed forward smooth factor of 50, and feed forward jitter factor of 5. The problem now occurs is that this is different than the default in the tuning preset. And so the problem that happens is if I put this in first and then I do my tune after it, is that my tune is going to wipe out these settings. So you have to think about that a little bit. And I haven't figured, I've tried to think about a lot of different combinations for redundancy, and I haven't figured out a perfect way to make sure that that type of thing doesn't happen just because of these types of overlap. So how to use the presets. The way I recommend doing this is for the F411 boards, I've set up kind of this base preset. And if you look at what I've done is it does a lot of these things that I've talked about that are going to be kind of universal across tunes and setups as long as you're on F411. So some of those things are, we talked about turning off the things we don't need, like turning off the accelerometer. I've got props out. I've increased my PID sum limit. This is so because we're using such high feed forward and using high PID numbers, you need to increase this PID sum limit to 1,000. You need to increase or turn on your D-shot telemetry. So for example, bidirectional D-shot is on, and we're on D-shot 300, motor poser 12. And so there's a lot of things in here that kind of get you set up in your VBAT sag compensation. So this is a good one to drop in there, and it kind of takes care of a lot of those things. Rates, that's going to be more your personal preference, but if you want to try mine are there. Similar to, this is more in here for me, like my, so this is my receiver, my RX mapping, and that may or may not be appropriate for you. But things you definitely want to do if you're on Express LRS 500, you definitely want to jump on that and add that in. And so when you do these, you can pick, a bunch of them and you highlight them. And so if we're setting up our 1S tune, you want to go ahead and pick the tune. And then, if you happen to have the VTX I'm using, I tend to use these nanos. But basically, you grab all these ones that you want, and you go ahead and save reboot. And now it's going to go ahead and apply all of these and set them up on your quad. But as I said, you got to go through and make sure that everything was kind of applied the way that you expect it to. And the one that I have a problem with is sometimes my jitter reduction gets messed up here, where because of the order of things, and I haven't, because if you do that RX preset before the tune, that it goes ahead and wipes it out. And I don't want to put that just into tune, like put it automatically into tune, because what if you're not flying Express LRS? What if you're flying something else? So there's some order here where I have to go in and say, okay, after I do that, that didn't get everything I wanted. So let me go ahead and make sure I go and grab my RX preset, load that one in there. And now when I go back, there's my jitter reduction. My jitter reduction is now correct because I hit the order correctly. So in my presets, I try and have as much redundancy in there as possible, and I try and help you out. So for example, I talked about the PID sublimit and the bidirectional D-shot. Anything that's not going to cause a problem, I have put it in here. So for example, if you happen to be on that new GEMQ F405 board, do you need D-shot 300? No, you can probably go up to 600 because you might be able to run AK. But D-shot 300 isn't going to necessarily harm you, so here it is, and it'll definitely keep you out of trouble if you're on F411. So I've tried to do that as much as possible. For example, you see here PID sum limit. So in case the PID sum limit was wiped out by a default, I put it back in here, and I'm trying to keep you out of trouble as best as possible. I think there's still a little bit of learning curve here as we kind of figure out all these issues and how we try and make these things cross-compatible across a bunch of different tuners and kind of ideas on how to apply the presets. More to come on that, because I've got the follow-up videos where we'll talk about PID tuning and we'll talk about specific quad builds, and we'll detail that out further. But I think this one has definitely run long enough, and I think that I've covered the main topics that probably aren't going to be as well covered in most of the other setup videos. So until next time, cheers.